For 30 years, Ellen Whitfield believed her father was the best man she'd ever known. Robert Whitfield built a name for himself in their small Ohio town, a man people trusted with their savings, their secrets, their sons and daughters. Ellen trusted him more than anyone alive. She defended him when others whispered. She believed him when the numbers didn't add up. Then one afternoon, inside a locked filing cabinet in his office, she found a single folder that would end everything she thought she knew. What she read that day would take her from a hospital bedside to a torn wedding photograph, to a lawyer's office where she would finally speak the truth out loud, in front of her father, in front of everyone. She forgave him, but not before she made sure the world knew exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost the people who loved him most. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ellen Whitfield grew up believing her father was a man without flaws. Robert Whitfield ran a small financial firm in their hometown of Millbrook, Ohio, and everyone in that town trusted him with the things they could not afford to lose. Ellen never questioned him, not once, not even when small things did not make sense. She was about to learn that the folder she found was only the beginning. Somewhere in her father's past was a decision that had quietly ruined another family, and Ellen was the only person left who could uncover it. Who exactly did Robert Whitfield betray, and why had he spent 30 years hiding it? What was the truth buried inside that folder? And why did it involve people Ellen had known her entire life? And when the truth finally reached the surface, would Ellen be strong enough to expose the father she loved, knowing it might destroy the only family she had left? These were the questions that would follow her for the rest of that year, questions she could not put down once she started asking them. To understand what Ellen found, you have to go back to where it all began, 15 years earlier, in a house on Maple Street that looked, from the outside, like nothing was ever wrong. Robert Whitfield had built his firm from nothing, starting with a single desk above a hardware store, working nights and weekends until Whitfield Financial became the name every family in Millbrook trusted with their savings. He was the man people called before they called their own brothers. Ellen grew up hearing him described that way, and she believed every word of it. At home, Robert was the father who taught Ellen to drive on empty Sunday roads, who worked double shifts the year she needed braces, who never once raised his voice, at least not in front of her. Her mother, Diane Whitfield, adored him the way people adore someone they have never had a reason to doubt. Ellen's older brother, Mark, had already left for college, and it was just Ellen and her parents most nights, sitting down to dinner in a house that felt, to Ellen, like the safest place on earth. But even safe houses have locked drawers. Ellen remembered, even as a child, a filing cabinet in her father's home office that was never left open, not even for a moment. She remembered a name that came up once at dinner and was never mentioned again, a man named Walter Combs, who her father said used to be his business partner a long time ago, before things did not work out between them. When Ellen asked what happened to him, her father simply said the business world was hard, and some men could not handle the pressure. She never asked again. There was also a woman named Grace Sullivan, whom Ellen met only once, at a grocery store, when she was around 12 years old. Her mother had gone pale seeing her, had rushed Ellen out of the aisle before introductions could happen. Ellen remembered asking who that was, and her mother had simply said, quietly, that it was someone from a long time ago, someone they did not need to discuss. Ellen filed the moment away, the way children file away things they do not yet have the tools to understand. Years passed, and Ellen grew into a woman who admired her father even more than she had as a child. She watched him mentor young men at his firm, donate quietly to the hospital where she eventually worked as a nurse, and never once ask for credit. To everyone in Millbrook, Robert Whitfield was proof that a good man could build something lasting without cutting corners. It was this version of her father that made what she found later so difficult to accept, and so important for her not to look away from. The unraveling began the year Robert had his first heart scare, when Ellen, newly given power of attorney over some of his affairs, was asked to retrieve paperwork from his home office while he recovered in the hospital. It was a simple errand, insurance documents for the hospital billing department, nothing more. But inside that locked filing cabinet, behind a row of ordinary folders, Ellen found one marked only with a date from over 20 years earlier, and inside it, documents that did not belong to her father's business at all. They belonged, according to the letterhead, to Walter Combs. At first, Ellen assumed it was simply old paperwork from the partnership her father had mentioned once, nothing worth a second look. But as she read further, sitting alone on the floor of that office with her father still recovering in a hospital bed across town, she found something that made her stomach turn. There were signatures on client withdrawal forms, dozens of them, and every single one appeared to be signed by Walter Combs. Yet the handwriting on each signature was identical to her father's own handwriting on documents she had seen 100 times before. Ellen sat with that folder for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. Client funds, meant for trust accounts, including one for a disabled boy named Peter Alden, had been withdrawn over the course of nearly 2 years, and every withdrawal had been signed as though Walter Combs had authorized it. Walter, according to the documents that followed, had been blamed publicly for the missing funds, had lost his license, his reputation, and eventually his health, within a year of the accusations reaching the local paper. The final document in the folder was a short, handwritten letter, undated, addressed to no one, in which Robert Whitfield admitted, in his own words, that the withdrawals had been his decision, made during a period when the firm was failing, and he could not bring himself to tell his young family the truth. He wrote that Walter had agreed to take responsibility so the firm could survive, believing it would be temporary, believing his name would eventually be cleared. It never was. Walter Combs died 3 years later, and the world never learned the truth. Ellen closed that folder and sat in silence for nearly an hour before she could move. Every memory she had of her father, every story she had told herself about the kind of man he was, now sat beside this letter, refusing to make sense together. She thought of Grace Sullivan in that grocery store aisle, a young girl whose father had died believing himself a thief, and Ellen understood, for the first time, that her family's comfort had been built, in part, on someone else's ruin. She did not confront her father that day, or even that week. Instead, Ellen did what she did best. She started asking careful, quiet questions, the way she had learned to when assessing a patient whose story did not add up. She reached out first to her brother Mark, testing whether he knew anything, but Mark had left Millbrook young and had no memory of Walter Combs beyond the name. Ellen realized she would have to go further back than her own family to understand what had truly happened. She found an old newspaper archive at the Millbrook Library, and there, in print from over 2 decades earlier, was the story exactly as her father's letter had described it. A respected local businessman named Walter Combs, accused of mismanaging client trust funds, including money meant for a disabled child's care. The article quoted a young associate at the firm, listed only as R. Whitfield, expressing shock and disappointment in his former partner. Ellen read that quote 3 times before she was able to continue. She traced Grace Sullivan through old records and found her living 2 towns over, working as a hairdresser, having never finished the college fund her own father had once promised her before his name was destroyed. Ellen did not approach her yet. She was not ready, and she was not certain what she would even say. Instead, she returned to the folder, and to a business ledger she found tucked behind it, one that appeared to track payments made quietly, every few years, to an account under the name Sullivan. It became clear to Ellen that her father had not simply let an old friend take the blame once and moved on. For over 20 years, Robert Whitfield had been sending money, small amounts, irregular, untraceable to anyone who was not looking for them, to Grace Sullivan's family. Ellen could not decide whether this made her father better or worse than she had feared. Was it guilt, or was it simply the cost of keeping a secret buried, a quiet insurance policy against a truth he never intended to tell? When Robert was released from the hospital and strong enough for a real conversation, Ellen finally brought the folder to him, laid it on the kitchen table between them, and asked him to explain. Her father did not deny it immediately. He sat for a long moment, staring at the folder as though greeting an old and unwelcome guest, and then he told her, in a quiet, steady voice, that the firm had nearly collapsed that year, that he had panicked, and that Walter had offered to shoulder the blame, believing it would only be temporary. He told Ellen that he had spent every year since trying to make it right in the only way he knew how, sending money quietly to Grace, never enough to raise suspicion, never enough to undo what had been done, but enough, he said, to ease his own conscience. He asked Ellen not to see him as a monster, but as a frightened young man who made one terrible decision and then spent the rest of his life paying for it in private, unable to find a way to say the truth out loud. For a while, Ellen believed him, or wanted to. There was a strange peace that settled over the family in the weeks that followed, as though naming the secret had somehow lightened it. Robert and Ellen had dinners again, longer ones, the kind filled with old stories retold without the same shine they used to have, but retold all the same. Diane noticed the change in both of them and did not ask questions, grateful simply that whatever distance had grown between her husband and daughter seemed, for now, to be closing. But Ellen was a nurse, trained to notice when something did not add up, and one detail from her father's story kept returning to her at night. He had told her the payments to Grace's family began the year after Walter died, out of guilt over his death. Yet the ledger she had found showed the first payment dated nearly 2 years before Walter Combs passed away, while he was still alive, still fighting to clear his name. That was not the timeline of a guilty man trying to make peace. That was the timeline of a man protecting himself. Ellen returned to the ledger late one night while her father slept, and this time she looked past the payments to Grace's family and toward the older entries, the ones from the very beginning of the firm. What she found made the earlier betrayal look almost small by comparison. The withdrawals from client trust accounts had not stopped after Walter took the blame. They had continued for nearly 6 more years, under new client names, hidden inside legitimate transactions, always just small enough not to draw attention from anyone who was not looking as closely as Ellen now was. Among those later withdrawals was one name that made Ellen's hands go cold as she read it, an account belonging to her own grandmother, Robert's mother, opened the year before she passed away in a care facility the family had once struggled to afford. Ellen had grown up hearing that her grandmother's final years had been paid for through her father's hard work and sacrifice. Now she understood that some of that money had come from other families' trust accounts, families who never knew where their missing funds had gone. Ellen also found, tucked at the very back of the ledger, a document that explained something she had never questioned before: why Peter Alden, the disabled boy whose trust fund had been drained at the very beginning, had eventually received a large, unexplained donation from an anonymous source when he turned 18. It was not generosity, it was restitution, made quietly, decades late, to a young man who never learned why a stranger had suddenly paid for his care. Robert Whitfield had spent half his life fixing what he never had the courage to confess. It was this discovery that changed something permanently in Ellen. Her father had not made one desperate mistake as a young man, and spent his life atoning for it in silence, as he had told her at that kitchen table. He had built an entire second life around managing the consequences of choices he continued making for years, choices that had shaped, quietly and invisibly, the lives of people all around Millbrook who never knew his name belonged in their story at all. Ellen decided she could no longer carry this alone. She reached out to an attorney named Thomas Reyes, a longtime friend of the family who had once articled at her father's firm decades earlier, and asked him, without explaining everything, what someone would need to do if they suspected historical financial misconduct involving trust accounts that were now decades old. Thomas listened carefully, then told her gently that the truth, however old, still belonged to the people it had been taken from, and that those people deserved the chance to finally know it. With Thomas Reyes's guidance, Ellen made copies of everything: the ledger, the letter, the newspaper clippings, and the records of every quiet payment her father had made over the years. She did not go to the authorities first. She went, instead, to Grace Sullivan, sitting across from her in a small kitchen 2 towns over, and told her, as gently and as honestly as she could, exactly what her father had done to Walter Combs, and exactly why the money had kept arriving every few years without explanation. Grace Sullivan did not cry, not at first. She sat very still, turning a coffee cup slowly in her hands, and told Ellen that some small part of her had always suspected the withdrawals were never really her father's fault, but that suspecting something, and having proof, were 2 very different kinds of grief. She thanked Ellen for coming to her directly, and then she asked the question Ellen had been dreading since she first opened that folder. She asked what Ellen intended to do now that she knew the truth. Ellen did not have a clean answer that day, but she knew what she would not do. She would not bury the folder the way her father had buried it for 30 years. Together with Thomas Reyes and Grace Sullivan, Ellen arranged a meeting at the State Financial Regulatory Office, presenting the ledger and the letter as evidence in a case that, though decades old, could finally correct the public record and formally clear Walter Combs's name for the family he had left behind. When Robert Whitfield learned what Ellen had done, he did not react with the anger she had braced herself for. Instead, he simply asked her, quietly, whether she understood what this would cost him, his reputation, the firm he had spent 40 years building, perhaps even his freedom. Ellen told him she understood exactly what it would cost, because she had spent weeks thinking of nothing else, but that the cost of staying silent had already been paid, for 30 years, by people who never had a say in the matter. The regulatory hearing that followed was quiet by most standards, held in a small conference room rather than a courtroom, but for Ellen it felt like the largest moment of her life. She watched her father sit across from officials and, for the first time in his life, tell the full truth without editing it to protect himself. He confirmed every withdrawal, every forged signature, and the decision, 30 years earlier, to let Walter Combs carry a burden that had always belonged to Robert alone. Grace Sullivan attended that hearing as well, sitting beside Ellen rather than across from her, and when the official record was finally amended to reflect that Walter Combs had been wrongly blamed, she reached over and took Ellen's hand without saying a word. It was a small procedural correction on paper, a single line changed in a decades-old file, but for Grace, it was the first time in her adult life that her father's name had been spoken publicly without shame attached to it. Robert Whitfield lost his license that year, and with it, the firm he had spent his entire adult life building. Some of Millbrook turned away from him entirely, unable to reconcile the man they had trusted with the truth Ellen had brought into the light. Others, quietly, admitted they respected him more for finally telling it, even decades too late. Diane Whitfield stood by her husband through the hearings, though something between them had shifted permanently, a trust that would need to be rebuilt from a much lower foundation than before. As for Ellen, she did not walk away from her father, though many people in town expected her to. She visited him every week, sat with him through the humiliation of rebuilding a life at 63 years old, and listened as he finally spoke honestly about the fear that had driven him as a young man, the fear of failure, of disappointing a family he had promised to provide for no matter the cost. Ellen did not excuse what he had done, but she began, slowly, to understand it. Months later, Ellen arranged one final meeting, not for the regulators or the newspapers, but for her family alone. She invited Grace Sullivan to sit across the table from her father for the first time, and she asked Robert to say, directly to Grace, the words he had spent 30 years avoiding. Robert Whitfield looked at the daughter of the man he had once sacrificed to save himself, and told her, plainly, that her father had been innocent, that he was sorry, and that no apology could ever return what her family had lost. Grace did not offer instant forgiveness, and Ellen never expected her to, but she told Robert that hearing the truth spoken aloud, after decades of silence, mattered more than he could understand. It did not undo what had happened to her father, but it gave her, finally, the ability to grieve him honestly, as a man who had been wronged, rather than as a man the whole town believed had wronged others. For Grace, that shift was its own quiet form of justice. In the months that followed, Ellen made peace with the complicated shape her father had turned out to have. She did not pretend the folder had never existed, and she did not let the family's comfort be rebuilt on silence a second time. But she also allowed herself to see him as a full person, capable of real love and real failure at once. A man who had spent half his life trying, imperfectly and too quietly, to fix a wound he had once been too afraid to name. Ellen Whitfield forgave her father, eventually, not because he deserved an easy pardon, but because she understood that forgiveness and accountability did not have to cancel each other out. She had made sure the truth reached the people who had been denied it for 30 years, and only after that truth was fully spoken did she allow herself to love her father again, honestly this time, without the comfortable fiction that had shaped her entire childhood. Would you have done what Ellen did, or would the fear of losing your family have kept you silent, the way it kept her father silent for 30 years? Is forgiveness ever truly complete without the truth coming first, or does silence only delay a debt that someone, eventually, always has to pay? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below, and if this story moved you, stay close, because the next story we have for you may be even harder to look away from.